Oh, hey, thank you so much, Tori. I'm really excited to be back. I was honored to be a part of the Riparian Planting Symposium in the first few years, helping with the steering committee, and I always look forward to the energy in the room and wish I could bottle it and bring it back home with me. I just love it that we're all together in this one room. And I'm really interested in talking about how riparian restoration materials matter and how we as practitioners can drive positive change through the materials that we choose. So let's see if we're going to get, I don't know if this clicker is going to work for me. It'd be nice if it did though, right? Oh, it might have gotten turned off. Okay. Thank you. Voila. All right. So there are four main areas I'm going to focus on today. Potting media and containers. So when we grow plants and buy plants, browse protection, weed suppression, and marking locations in the field. So when you look at this scene, I wonder what it brings up for you. When I look at it, I see a landscape that I just want to protect. I see a lake where I know that the common loon is nesting and beaver dams are holding waters back. And I see a wetland that's a peat meadow. And I see carbon sequestration orders of magnitude beyond what any forest could provide. I see a sponge that's ready to soak up water when there's debris flows after a wildfire, like there was in 2021 right above this meadow. And then let that water into the stream in late season flows. When there isn't enough water to go around, it will recharge those streams. I see biodiversity. I can only imagine the plants that might be growing in that wetland. We don't actually know because it hasn't really been studied. From what I can tell, the most recent and only study I've seen of it was from 1958 in a document called Peat Resources of Washington. You can Google it. It was put together by the Department of Conservation at the time to serve a distinct public need, which apparently at the time was that we know where the peat is so we can dig it up and sell it. It's explicitly stated in the introduction as the primary purpose of the document. And they went to great lengths to really measure all the different kinds of materials that would be available in every peat wetland in Washington state. So when I look at this picture, I also see, oh, it makes me think about the neighboring wetlands. I want to say that there are wetlands that have been studied nearby that are super special because the bedrock in this area is calcium-based. And so the water that's feeding these fens is basic. And it creates a calcareous fen, which means that instead of becoming acidic as peat forms and as organic material breaks down over thousands of years, it's circumneutral. What that means is that the plants growing in these wetlands are rare. It's a very special situation to have a circumneutral wetland, a fen. And there are numerous different rare plants that have been documented in these wetlands. The one on the left is a wetland of conservation significance under the Natural Heritage Program. The one on the right is rated as status as vulnerable both in the state and globally. So we know that this neighborhood is very special and that this peat wetland that I'm showing you is likely to have some really amazing biological diversity. Okay, so what I also see is a brown spot where that red arrow is pointing. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. That's where peat is being extracted, right there. You can see it from an overlook that's really quite far away. And we're going to look at how this has changed over time very quickly because there's a lot I want to talk about today. But between 1940s and 2021, you can see some changes that we could talk more about if we had more time. We're going to go through a really quick history. So the 40s just is zoomed into one part of this peat meadow. And then 1983. And we're just going to watch it change over time as more and more peat is pulled out of the wetland and sold to people who are growing plants. Okay, so this is what it looks like from space at this point. Now there was a fire in 2021 that I mentioned, and it burned this peat meadow, a big portion of it, and this is fireweed that came back afterward. You gotta love fireweed, right? It's just so robust. So, I'm thinking about water quality and quantity, flood mitigation, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, all the things that we all love, right? Preaching to the choir, I don't even need to say any more on that. But why are we using peat to grow plants in 2024? I'm so baffled. And I think that we're just not aware. We're not thinking about it. I've loved plants my whole life. When I was in high school, I had 99 plants in my big brother's room because he went off to college and I took over the windows. And I was just like, yes, I'm going to propagate. I'm going to learn all the ways of propagating plants, and I'm going to try them all, and I'm going to take them to science fair. Okay, I had no idea what I was growing the plants in. I just got potting soil at a store, like so many of us do. It's beautiful. This is the product that comes out of the peat meadow that I showed you a picture of when it's been mixed in with other amendments to be sold for growing plants. You can see it next to some topsoil. Next, obviously, it's a beautiful product. So as riparian restoration practitioners, what can we do in growing and purchasing plants to help protect our wetlands that we're out there trying to restore? Well, I want to show you a model from the United Kingdom, because they started extracting from peat wetlands long before we did, and so they saw degradation sooner, and they started doing something about it 40 years ago. So if you go to the UK as a grower, a horticulturist, a restoration practitioner, you'll find headlines like this. I took these screenshots. That sale of peat compost will be banned in 2024 in a retail context. So you will no longer be able to go into a store and buy a bag of potting media that has peat as an ingredient as a customer in a retail store. But conservation groups in the UK right now are so frustrated because they just found out that peat is not going to be completely banned from the industry until 2030. And that is frustrating because they've been trying for a long time. But for us in the United States or Canada, if we had 2030 on the radar as like our date that was actually going to happen, that would be a miracle, because very few of us are even thinking about it. Even those of us who love peat wetlands very passionately might not be aware of the impact of our purchasing, right? So this to me is like where we're headed, but we have a long ways to go. And I'm going to give you an example of what they're doing. They've hired a person full-time to work on the transition to peat-free with the Royal Horticultural Society. And he says, I believe that many organic byproducts from agricultural and horticultural processes, which are currently considered waste, should instead be regarded as out-of-place resources that have potential to replace peat. Thank you, Dr. Prasad. Yes, that's exactly it. And that's what I'm working with. I am a project manager for the Methow Beaver project. We're a program of Methow Salmon Recovery Foundation. And on the side, I'm starting a native plant nursery just as my own little backyard project. And this is what it's about. It's about how can we take waste products and turn them into beautiful potting media so that when we go to restore wetlands, we're not contributing to the degradation of wetlands. So I just loved how he said that. So what are some of the alternatives? You will see coconut coir marketed as a sustainable alternative to peat. And what I've learned is that it can be. When I first looked into it, well, first of all, don't you love that cross-section? It reminds you of being in a botany class. That's a coconut, but it just looks like you're learning about seeds. So coconut coir is that middle fibrous coat, and it's taken out and processed into a media that can really be used as a peat substitute. You will see it listed as a sustainable alternative because it's not peat. Yay, that's great. However, there's some really serious implications for water quality. These are all the steps that coir has to go through to get processed. This is put out by a company who produces coir. And not to be forgotten is that ship at the end. It does have to be transported halfway across the world, no matter how it's processed. It has to be washed sometimes 2 times with copious amounts of water. And because coconuts grow near the ocean, there's a lot of salt in the fiber that has to be removed. To do that expediently, they often add calcium nitrate, which then washes into the water, and you have indigenous people who are relying on their water supply that's now been polluted because coconut coir had to get washed twice, and they used calcium nitrate in the process. And then the people who are processing it are breathing in all this dust. And there have been studies that have shown direct correlation with respiratory illness, people who have processed coir. So it matters where you get your coir. And in India, they're trying really hard to develop different ways of processing it that are more responsible. They've come up with this biochem solution that uses bacteria to help break it down. And if you buy coir products in the United Kingdom, they will be assessed through this responsible sourcing scheme If they haven't been, then consumers are now at the point where they're like, what's that? I'm not buying it. It hasn't gone through the responsible sourcing scheme. Not going to buy it. So they look at all the metrics on that bulleted list in order to assess every product that could be used in potting media. So they're not just looking at one thing like water quality or human health. They're looking at energy, water, social, habitat, pollution, resource use efficiency, renewability, including like coconut coir gets marked down because of how much water it takes to reconstitute it. So it's not just about how it's produced, it's also about the water required to use it. And so that's one way that they're handling, figuring out how to get a responsible product. So if you went into a store in the UK, you'd see this rating. It would be A, B, C, D, or E, depending on how it's scored on a combination of all those metrics. But what about, if you want to learn more, Melcourt Industries Limited has been doing this for 40 years. They've never had peat in their potting media, and there's a ton of good technical data on their website. I just wanted to point that out in case people want to do some more reading. But what about if you're in Washington State and you want to buy a bag of potting media, like just to start some seeds or to grow some plants? I found 3 products that you can actually ask for at your local stores. The first one, I was so excited, this peat-free potting mix, and then I found it's out of stock online and in all Home Depot stores, so not super available. However, they do have this near source option, which is, there's 223 bags of it in stock in the OMAC Home Depot right now. So kudos to them for carrying a peat-free product. You do have to look for it and know what you're looking for. And then I called Ace Hardware and talked to the manager in the town where I live, and she was like, wait, what's peat? When I asked for peat-free, and I said, well, I'd love to tell you more about it. And she was really receptive, and I told her all about my concerns. And she searched her database, and she found that Miracle-Gro makes a raised bed and garden soil peat-free media. And it's not marketed for container growing, but I'm sure you could use it for container growing. And like, I'm not a Miracle-Gro fan or anything, but like, I was impressed. So that is something you can ask for. She's gonna order a bag of it just because she's curious. And I asked her to just carry 1 bag, like at least, so if someone walks in the store, they can buy it. And I told her she'd be ahead of the curve if she did. So you really do have to pay attention though, because things can be marketed as peat-free, but also you may not feel really good about them. This one is this Fedco Seeds Turbo Seed Starter. I thought that looked promising, right? It's peat-free. And it says it's from like an organic farm in Maryland, but they're using coconut coir. So when I looked at the ingredients, I was like, I wonder where that's from. So I contacted the company, and my email has bounced around to like all these different staff members, and they're kind of like, where's it from? Well, we think it might be from India. That's how much they know about it. They're gonna ask someone else who's gonna ask someone else who's gonna try to get back to me. But clearly they're not thinking about like, how is this coir produced, and are people getting sick? Is water being polluted in the process? So I've bought this one before, Whitney Farms Organic Potting Soil. Look at the marketing on it. Alfalfa meal, forest products, kelp. That looks pretty good, right? Then you look at the ingredients. It's kind of like if you have dietary restrictions and you have to read the ingredients. What's the second ingredient? Oh, we didn't take a picture of that because we didn't really want to highlight that, but the second ingredient is peat. So yeah. So what can you do? As a grower, I'm really excited about experimenting with unusual waste products, turning them into something beautiful. And so here are some examples of things that I'm experimenting with that you could too if you're into growing plants. Wool pellets. So sheep wool gets sheared, and then the best wool gets turned into yarn, and the junky low-grade wool gets thrown away, tossed down a bank somewhere to biodegrade. Nobody wants it. You can't make anything out of it, but you can pelletize it, and it makes a really cool peat substitute. It's very absorbent, so it holds moisture, but it also releases nitrogen slowly over time. How cool is that? I think it's really cool, so I ordered 1,000 pounds. But it works really well. I've been using it, I love it. It's really expensive, so I might not order it again just because I need to learn how to live without it now that I've fallen in love with it. It's about $60 per cubic foot, so that's not exactly, a great deal for somebody who's doing a side project to demonstrate how sustainable these processes can be, economically for a small business. So it can be used as an amendment. Basically what I'm gonna do is use less of it. But this pit moss, I just got a sample of it a few days ago, and I'm very impressed. It's a recycled paper product, and it works so well when you mix it with compost and broken down, shredded up, aged wood products, and you squeeze it. It's like, it feels like a good potting mix. I brought some of it. I brought some of all of these things if you want to check them out. There's a rolling cart kind of next to the coffee, and there's free samples if you want of the wool pellets, because I found out after I ordered them from Utah that there's somebody in Washington State who produces wool pellets, and she sent me a whole bunch of cute little bags to give out in case anybody wants to try working with them. And then just recycled forest products. This one is called G&B Soil Building Conditioner, and it works really well. I was so excited about the ingredient list until I saw this. They had added mycorrhizae, and I was like, oh no, what kind? What did they do? And it turns out they're not native, and I don't feel comfortable spreading them around because they could take over the native mycorrhizal populations. So I'm heat treating the heck out of it to try to kill the mycorrhizae that they added, because it's otherwise a beautiful product. It's also a good price. And then just good old-fashioned, wood chips that have aged for a long time. This is wood chips. They've just been sitting long enough to look like that. And then compost, for example, BCS Livestock in the Methow Valley sells their composted sheep manure and straw mix. So that's a nice compost to be added. And then this is one of my students from when I was a teacher in Oroville. We were raking leaves at an elderly woman's home because we needed leaves for our compost, and she needed her leaves to be raked, and that was a great combo. So just, using, instead of burning leaves, people burn leaves like crazy in Okanagan County, creates a huge air quality problem, just as bad as wildfire smoke. Why burn it when we could compost it and make beautiful potting media? So those are a few options. I heat treat everything that I use because weed seeds, plant pathogens, non-native mycorrhizae, there's lots of reasons. So in case you're curious, I'm aiming for 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 Celsius because most weed species that have, all of the weed seed species that were studied in the research that I've reviewed were killed at that temperature. But I go for a longer duration just to make sure it's uniformly reached throughout the batch. How can you mix your own potting media? You can pour from one huge tub into the other. That actually is kind of backbreaking, so I bought a barrel composter. I put all the ingredients in there, and I can just spin it up. If you want to see me doing this, you can follow Beaver Food Forest on Instagram or Facebook, and I'm posting reels of my learning journey. Here's a couple of my favorite recipes. I don't have time to read them out, but they're printed on my little rolling cart next to the tea and coffee if you want to check them out. And that's what they look like. And so we can do this. What can you do as a practitioner? You can just ask your grower, ask your nursery, ask your hardware store, hey, do you carry peat-free? Are you willing to grow plants that are peat-free? Because if your grower hasn't been asked that before, they might not have thought about it. Or maybe they have thought about it and they just need a little extra nudge. Or maybe they need you to say like, hey, I'm willing to pay a little bit more. If it costs you more to grow plants without using peat, that is worth it. And I will pay a little more in order to not degrade wetlands for the sake of repairing wetlands. You can plan ahead when you're writing grants. And you know what I just learned last night? I was talking with Mark Ingham at the social, and he said that there's this environmentally preferable products. It's actually an executive order, I looked it up, that was maybe put out like 10 years ago or so. And state agencies are required to increase their purchasing of environmentally preferable products. How does that trickle down to us as like grant recipients from the Department of Ecology? I've heard that it might be in the fine print of our agreement to try to purchase environmentally preferable products, EPP. So I will look that up when I get a chance. I just found out about it last night and I haven't had a chance to look at any of my ecology agreements to see if it's in there. But this is something we can plan ahead for. We can write it into our grants. And I did write it into my most recent ecology grant application that we wanted to purchase peat-free plants. But I didn't know that it's actually something that's state mandated, or at least it could fall under the EPP requirements. So we can make a difference. I think if people in this room went out to their communities, if you all went and asked your growers, your nurseries, your stores about carrying peat-free, it would make a difference. I think people would start to think about it more. But if we're not asking for it from our suppliers, they're not going to be super motivated to provide it. unless they just happen to learn about it and care about it. Okay, so that's it for potting media. Moving on to browse protection. Yes, we have to protect our plants from browse. We have deer, we have all kinds of herbivores, and things can get damaged, things that are really valuable. So how do we protect our plants in the floodplain? Are we just installing garbage on the floodplain? I mean, we've all seen this, right? This is a very standard practice to put these little plant protectors around our plants. And invariably, if they're next to the stream, they're going to get closer to the stream inadvertently. They're probably going to end up in the stream, right? And do we just hope that doesn't happen? I hope it doesn't happen. This is just a short walk I took through a project site collecting random protectors that I found laying around. The wind had blown them. Cages, I mean, this yellow warbler loves perching on this cage, but it's so close to the water. And when we're doing projects that are intended to change the hydrology, these cages can very easily end up right in the middle of the stream. And it's crazy how many photos I have to show you. These are all photos I took of this issue. This does not qualify as adding structure to the stream, sorry. So what could we do instead? I just want to encourage you to get creative and play with natural materials. Here's one idea. You could plant your willow stem and gather debris and pile it around till you can't see it anymore. If you can't see it, and the deer probably can't see it, they could probably smell it, but there's probably something else that's easier to get at. And so your plant will grow under this debris pile. It won't be maybe 100% as happy as it would be if it didn't have debris on it, but it's less likely to get browsed, and it will continue to develop a root system. Even if it gets browsed at the top of that debris pile, year after year, it will develop a root system until it's so well supported by its roots that it can just shoot right up as soon as it gets a chance. So this is also fun to do with volunteers because people I don't know how many of you grew up playing outside with sticks and rocks and mud and stuff. I did. I love playing with sticks, and I have been fortunate to have a bunch of volunteers who love this kind of thing. Hey, let's go gather some sticks and pile it around. It's fun. Here's another couple examples of plants that you can also use larger woody debris that's pre-existing and insert your plants into that debris. It's a little bit more work, but rather than installing a cage, you have natural protection that's existing. Some people call this jackstraw protection. So what can you do? Try using dead and down material. Plan ahead for using woody debris. It's interesting how many people, our first reaction will be like, oh yeah, I'll use debris to protect a planting if it happens to be right there. But I'm not gonna bring debris over to my plant. I'm not gonna bring it onto the site. That's too much work. But I will take my truck and drive to the nearest town that has a big box store, and I'll buy caging materials and T-posts and come with a post pounder and install it. That's perfectly acceptable. So it's kind of like a mental shift of thinking, oh, maybe it's just as acceptable to bring woody debris from a forest thinning project onto a riparian site where I want to try protecting my plants in a way that if the flood plain gets activated and the water comes and washes it all away, there's no garbage that's left on the landscape. Okay, weed suppression. Would you like paper or plastic? Those are a couple of the options that we hear a lot. Let's take a look. So individual plant coverage, I'm going to go over that first. This is not a model project. This was done by a mining company as part of mitigation for their mine. They were struggling to get their plants to survive, so everything died and they replanted, and they thought it would be a good idea to try these little tiny weed suppression fabric squares around every plant. They didn't stake them down either, so you can imagine where this is headed. Yeah. Oh man, it's just like any kind of garbage in the creek. It's no better. So if you want to do individual plant protection, this has worked really well for me in the past. This is a volunteer installing a live stake. This is what we put around it on day one because we didn't have time to do a whole nice mulching job. We just put one piece of cardboard so it'd be easy to find the cutting in the future and we put a cage. It wasn't too close to the creek. And then we mowed around it. It was reed canary grass. So we mowed around it for a couple of months till we had time to have a work party and actually put wood chips on top of the cardboard, actually made the cardboard perimeter a little bigger. And then we just mowed around it 5 times a growing season. And 6 years later, I went back to visit that same cutting. So that is the exact same spot. You can see the T-post, same T-post. That's what it looks like 6 years later. And this is when I worked with Okanagan Highlands Alliance this is our Triple Creek project. You can learn more about it on their website, okanaganhighlands.org. But that worked really, really well. And it was not a lot of labor to install the cardboard and the wood chips around each plant. It definitely is some work to do the mowing, but we budgeted in our grant to pay a contractor to mow 5 times a year. Boom, done. She would just show up and mow. And it worked really, really well. Incidentally, if you're dealing with Canada thistle went away. Did not like being mowed like that. It's just by 2 or 3 years, it was gone. Okay, so here's another example of mulching around each plant. It looks really messy, but this is day 1. That's all we kind of had the time for that day, and then we ended up adding more cardboard and wood chips later. What about covering larger areas? This is the thing we see most commonly done. This is our plastic weed fabric. And then this is our weed coming right through like they like to do. So this is really, often used as a quick and easy fix. This is less often used. This is a low density polyethylene 60 mil. It's really thick. We actually were able to get that from the mining company when they were done using it for lining some areas for water quality reasons. So this is harder to come by, but actually it was pretty amazing because it's not going to break down into a million pieces and you can reuse it over and over and over. But it's non-permeable, so there's implications for soil health and all kinds of things. I don't think it's necessarily a super great option, but there it is. We used it for preparation before planting in reed canary grass. But what about using natural materials? Well, it's really helpful to have a crew like we had the Curlew Job Corps come from their forestry program, a group of young people who are strong and used to building fire breaks. And this is what they did. They put cardboard right over the reed canary grass where it was laid down in the spring, and then wood chips right over that. And then this is 5 months later. And if you see it now, it's just a jungle of willow and elderberry. It's beautiful. And so that's, natural materials that are going to break down. Here's another before and after, 2017, 2 years later, 2019. So this was reed canary grass. And we put down cardboard and wood chips, and then we used rebar with a T-handle welded onto it by one of our volunteers, and then just poke a hole through the cardboard after it's had a chance to get wet and soften up. Poke a hole through it, and then just put your willow cutting right in there. Pour some muddy water in there to increase soil to stem contact. Works really, really well. And this is just an absolute willow jungle now. And it was 100% reed canary grass when we started. Also, I want to encourage you to think outside the box. Maybe we don't always need materials. Yes, material sourcing matters, but when you know your site, if you're working in reed canary grass and you have any kind of shade existing, even in one spot, if you mow it at least like 5 times a growing season, look at this. This was reed canary grass growing here before, where it's brown. It almost looks like it's been sprayed with an herbicide or something. All we did was mow it in the shade. So just combining mowing and shade is really effective. And then we mulched around our plants just to make sure they had a leg up. Here's a quick cost comparison. This was provided by the Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group. Thank you so much, Carson. Just looking really quickly at the cost of weed suppression fabric for an 1,800 square foot area, $160 if you use just wood chips without cardboard. $726, so it is going to cost you a little more, but let's look at the pros and cons. Here's a pros and cons list for the weed suppression fabric. I've got one pro. It's quick, cheap, easy to install. I've got a whole bunch of cons. It requires plastics manufacturing, the sourcing and pollution related to that. It's ultimately destined for a landfill someday. It often allows weeds to go through. It doesn't contribute to soil health. It can even kill mycorrhizal network if it gets really overheated in the hot sun. Looks unnatural, looks unpleasant. Let's look at the wood chip mulch. We've got a whole bunch of pros and a couple of cons. So I guess I should have added another con that weeds can grow through it too, but I'll do that for next time. But it utilizes waste products instead of requiring manufacturing. It breaks down naturally, so it's not destined for the landfill. It contributes to soil health. It's amazing how much it improves soil health, including the fungal network underground. And it looks natural and it looks pleasant. It can cost more and it requires more labor to install. But plastic fabric will not bring me these. And these are all pictures I took. The lower ones are in areas that I sheet mulched with cardboard and wood chips. And we even got like shaggy mane and morels coming up, which is pretty fun. And the others are found in naturally rich woody debris in the forest. But definitely not something you're going to see with a plastic weed barrier. So what can you do? Again, planning ahead. When you're writing a grant, you can think about the expenses that would be involved to do it the way you think it should be done. Instead of like, well, I'm just going to do it the cheapest way because I want my number to be low so I get funded. No, you want to blow your funder away with your thoughtfulness. And it's okay if it costs a little more in the budget. You can even ask local arborists if they're willing to drop by with their wood chips. They have to dump them somewhere. So if your location is handy, that could even work out to be free. Last one is leaving our mark. So we love to mark things, don't we, on our restoration projects? Right here, this is how I used to mark things when I started in-stream restoration, because why not, right? Everyone uses flagging material, and I was all about being able to find that beaver dam again, or that plant, or make sure I don't weed whack a special plant, find that bird survey station. But inevitably, it does become garbage, and it's actually really sad. And like this, for example, was a wetland delineation that was done by a project partner on a project site. I was grateful they did the delineation for us. I was like, oh, cool, they marked the whole edge of the wetland. That's so neat to be able to see that. And then I see the flag in the creek, and it's like, oh, maybe that wasn't the best place to put a plastic flag. Same thing with my beaver dam inventory. You know, I lost the flag off of that. So what do I do instead now? I love buying these 1x2 furring strips from hardware stores, and I just cut them in half and dip them in paint so they're pre-colored. And you can write with a paint pen, whatever you want to write on there. You can write with a Sharpie beneath it if you want to take notes about your location. You can use rebar with a cap. It's a little bit less natural of a product, but also works and is less likely to get lost as garbage. And you can buy biodegradable flagging. A lot of people don't know about that. Go into your hardware store and just ask them. And they'll probably say, what is that? I don't know, but let me check into it. I've found hardware stores to be surprisingly receptive to looking for this product. So I just buy like a stack of 30 of them and take a skill saw and cut it down the center at an angle. So they're all pointy on one end, ready to go in the ground, and then dip them in brightly colored paint. This is what it looked like, marking the spots where BDAs were going to go in. Worked really well. And they persisted for years and years. Like, it's really amazing how long they last compared to flagging. Look at this. Can you imagine? I happened upon this at a project site, and I was like, what were they thinking? But if you need to mark specific plants because you're going to weed whack around them or what have you, I'd like to encourage you to paint the plant instead of flagging the plant. And you might cringe a little bit with adding latex plant onto a plant tissue. It is a little bit like, oh, I'm sorry, little plant. But look at this plant in my nursery right now. It just burst through the latex. So it's budding out anyways. So it's really not stopping its growth. This is what it looks like after years in the field. You see that orange? I like to color my Pacific willow orange. So those are both Pacific willow, but they're years apart. Here's where the regular stem started to grow, or the main stem began to grow. And this is some volunteers that are using some of my painted cuttings. You know what's awesome about having paint on the tips of all your cuttings? You can say to your volunteer who knows, maybe they don't know anything about plant identification, hey, I want you to plant the coyote willow, go grab the blue ones, right? Or plant survival surveys. Hey, can you please count all the yellow ones? Yeah, they can help with your survey. They don't need to be able to identify the plant. It's already color-coded. And they're not going to plant it upside down. And that does happen. So, yeah, so these are things that you can do. You know, we've got this. We've just got to think ahead a little bit more. And, you know, we must do better. And we can. And last night we were talking with somebody at the social marketing. I mentioned him once already. I got so many great ideas from him. And he mentioned the idea of death by 1,000 cuts. And in relation to restoration. So if you're wondering whether or not your small, successful project matters, it does. Because if we see our landscape dying death from 1,000 cuts, what it needs is healing in 1,000 tiny little locations. Right? And that's what we're doing. And then we want to build on that and keep working up the tributaries and a whole bunch of other tiny little locations that can connect. So let's counter that death by 1,000 cuts with death in 1,000 tiny locations, with healing in 1,000 tiny locations. And let's just try to like take all of our little projects and have them count together for a lot of positive change that can end up being watershed wide. Okay, I'm all done. So Q&A. What's that? 10 minutes for questions. All right, questions? Yes. I don't know if I can call on people or if I need to wait for microphones. Oh, it's not turned on. Yes. Yes, I've worked with biochar in the ground, and I'm really interested in including biochar in my potting media. And we have a group doing biochar in the Methow Valley. I've reached out to them, and I haven't heard back yet. But I love biochar. I found it to be really effective for in-ground planting, and that's kind of a whole other rabbit hole. But I think that it's an important one, and I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't have it in my presentation because I haven't started working with it yet. But I do think that's a very important one for us to consider. Yeah. And effective. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. It's really important where you source your compost and straw from. For that reason, there can be residual herbicides and pesticides, aminopyrrolid being one example. And I've run into that and I've suffered that same fate. And so I'm really picky about where I'm going to buy my composted manure and straw from. So I buy from BCS Livestock because they're really careful about that. And I won't use manure from like a random farm. Yeah, it's too risky. It's true. I'm glad you brought that up too. There's so many side points that are really important when we're thinking about materials sourcing, and that one matters a lot. So organic straw is important, and then what the animals are eating, where they're grazing, and how much exposure they've had to chemicals, because otherwise you can just create a toxic environment for your plants, and it obviously spreads even farther. So thank you for that. Yes. Oh, that's a great idea. I could provide you with a script. Yeah, definitely. So what's the best way to reach me? I didn't, did I put my contact info at the beginning? I don't know if I can get, I'm going to make you all dizzy. I'm sorry. But I think I put it at the very beginning. I didn't remember to put it at the end. But this is my email with the Methow Beaver project. Feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to provide you with a list of questions that you might consider asking your growers. Thank you.
Are such an inspiration to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chevelle. I really appreciate that.
I was really encouraged about your canary grass victories. I think that's kind of a problem we all have. And so the cardboard trick with the chips was really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
I was thinking about mitigation sites at the outset being put onto paper. What plastic costs, what sticks costs, to think about the out-of-the-box solution where you have sticks.
Yeah.
I think the paradigm would need to be spread and say, hey, one more question. It would be the stake issue. I get it, that stuff stays forever. And another problem with stakes is they disappear. You're saying that they're here forever. What I don't like is they disappear.
Yeah.
Cows,
Right.
steel, they use campfires, or something like that. You know, we live in an age of GPS. Technology is getting really, really good.
Yeah.
I use my cell phone. It's good for 12 inches. I'm just hoping that someday we can have technology
Yeah.
maybe temporarily to say, hey, my crew,
Yeah.
plant here.
Sure. Yeah.
Just wanted to throw that out.
That's a really good point. We don't need our points to be marked physically in perpetuity. And we do have technology at our fingertips. Thank you for making those points. I just love the amount of sharing that happens at these symposiums. It's so great.
Thanks a lot, Julie, for your presentation. This has been awesome. And maybe I missed it, but I hope I didn't miss it. Just kind of thinking about your horticulture in general. You've done the horticulture 101, you know, about your absorbent media, component of the media, which is, of course, like the peat and the coconut coir, and then all these great alternatives, and then sort of the nitrogen component of all that you really covered well. One part I was wondering is just on the drainage side, if you could speak to that, because usually, you know, the little white petals people see in their potting mix, vermiculite and perlite. I know at least one of those two is pretty high energy. Think of popcorn. And then, or mine. So I guess I'm reaching for like, what's wrong with good old sand? Or, yeah, why is that a concern or not a concern with these alternatives?
Thank you. I appreciate that question. I've so far avoided using vermiculite or perlite in my backyard nursery. I've used it at the Oroville Native Plant Nursery, which I helped start at the school district there. It is very effective for drainage, like you said. It is energy intensive also, like you said. So what I'm doing currently is a large portion of my plants are riparian species. And so I'm more interested in moisture retention than I am in a lot of drainage, high drainage media. So I've been focusing there to start with, but I have started using sand. And I think sand is a viable alternative for drainage as an alternative to perlite or, you know, or vermiculite. Vermiculite is also bad for your lungs. You don't want to be breathing that in. So, you know, I can report back to you on how the sand is working when I've had a little more time to see how it performs. But I'm heat treating it too because I don't know what kind of pathogens or weed seeds it could be bringing in, even though I'm buying it in bags commercially. And so that way, just making sure that it's not going to be contributing to, you know, issues with plant disease. But yeah, I think that that's my go-to. Is your question about chicken manure with the bedding? Yeah. I would age it for, you know, a year if I was going to use it in potting media. And I would make sure there's enough carbon mixed in with it and that it's aerated and turned. And you can judge a lot about chicken manure from the smell over time. You know, ideally you don't want your potting media to smell like manure, and that, you know, it is sort of a symbol of where it's at in the process of degradation, what it smells like. But, you know, there's also a soil testing lab in Moses Lake that my understanding is it's the only lab in Washington State that tests compost for its constituents, and that's where I'm going to be testing my potting media. And you could, for example, send them a sample and be curious, you know, after you've aged it, what you think is an adequate amount of time, you could run it by them and see what they have to say. Called the Soil Test Lab.
Our whole table, we're all watching Conservation Corps, and we're all freaking out, and like sending you love the whole time. This was great. Thank you. I get these questions all the time as a supervisor of like, why are we pulling up 5 tons of plastic? So thank you. And this might be a silly question, but when I've led projects in the past, we spend our time having to take off, pick out every single staple. It takes hours to use recycling board.
Yes.
What do you do about that?
That is so not a silly question. Thank you. It's a great question. And part of it for me is sourcing the cardboard you want large pieces. If you're getting like household recycling, little boxes, that is so much labor to deplastic them. So the larger the piece, the less of that kind of work you have to do. I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but I don't worry about the staples because I think they're going to break down over time. They're for me kind of an insignificant impact, but maybe I'm overstating the. And feel free to tell me if you're worried about staples. I'm all ears. But I tend to let them be in place and let them break down. Another alternative would be to buy rolls of. It's basically a material that, like, if you have a house that's already constructed and you're doing some renovations and you want to protect the flooring, your contractors will come in with a big roll of paper, really heavy duty paper, and they'll roll it out on the floor. You could buy that and just roll it out across your planting plot, and it would be so fast to install. It's like $38 a roll. It's not that expensive. It would save you a ton of labor. There'd be no plastic or staples. And I've always wanted to try that, but I just found out about it last night from staying with Nancy and Chuck Warner, and Chuck suggested. I was like, that is what I've always wanted, is a roll of something like that. So that's one way to get around it. Some people in permaculture, like in a small scale garden, will leave the plastic and then they'll collect it after the cardboard breaks down because it persists and you can go around and find it. But I know that's kind of hard to stomach in terms of we're talking about trying not to leave plastic on the landscape. So my biggest recommendation with the cardboard is to go to maybe a chainsaw repair shop. They have these enormous boxes and it's way less labor to deplastic those. Just be picky about what kind of boxes you accept. Oh, the pallets, those pallet liners too. Oh, sorry. Okay. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, and feel free to take a free sample of wool pellets from that rolling cart in the back by the coffee.
Thanks so much.